Welcome everyone, and I see people are still joining us, so we'll give it another couple of minutes. And for those who have just joined, we're just waiting for a couple more people to join. We had a good number of registrants, so we're hoping to see that number reflected in people who join the webinar. So we'll just give it a couple of more minutes. I've just got an email from someone who has some difficulties joining the webinar, so I'll give it another couple of minutes.
It's always tricky when everyone's using slightly different software, isn't it?
Exactly, yes, yeah. Many people may be used to Zoom or Teams.
Teams,
so much
that's what
WebEx.
that's what we use, Teams.
Yeah. So I'll start at 5:05, but yeah, I think so welcome everyone. Good afternoon. Thanks for everyone joining this webinar on good statistical practice on a Monday afternoon, and our speaker on 7 a.m. on a Monday morning in the UK. My name is Sabine Braat, and I will be chairing this ACTA Statistics in Trial webinar. And before we kick off, in the spirit of reconciliation, the Australian Clinical Trials Alliance acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respect to their elders past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people today. I would like to introduce you to our speaker, Professor Deborah Stockham. Deborah is a National Institute for Health research professor and director of the Surgical Interventions, Diagnostics and Devices Division at the Leeds Institute of Clinical Trials Research in the United Kingdom. Deborah has a broad spectrum of clinical trials knowledge and experience with successful NIHR and charity-funded portfolio, ranging from early phase safety studies to international effectiveness trials. Her research professorship is Statistical Innovation and Guidance on Methods and Analysis in Surgical Research, or for short, Sigma-S, with statistical interest in adaptive trial design and multivariable prediction modeling. She is responsible for developing and delivering methodologically robust research, scalable for NHS adoption, and fostering multidisciplinary links for portfolio expansion. But today, Deborah will be presenting on good statistical practice, the development of tailored good clinical practice training for statisticians. We will have a Q&A at the end, and you can post your questions into the Q&A function on the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. Please mute yourself during the presentation, and we can come back to your questions at the end. I will be watching out for any of the questions you may have and posing them at the end. So Deborah, thank you so much for presenting at such an early hour, and I look forward to learning more about good statistical practice.
Great. Thank you very much, Sabine. And thank you very much. It was lovely to meet you at the International Clinical Trials Conference. And it's really kind of you to invite me to speak to you today. I've got various screens going on, so I'm sorry if my eyes are sort of shooting around and I can't see you as the audience. But I know you're there. So good morning from the United Kingdom. It's really good to be able to share after actually many years of development of this training. This is training that we have put together, good statistical practice training for statisticians that currently sits on our NIHR Learn platform. And I just thought the training itself is quite in depth and it takes quite a few hours to go through. So what I wanted to share with you today was just some of the background of how this project came around and the development of the training that we've created. So I just need to acknowledge our funders, who are the National Institute for Health and Care Research under the Efficient Clinical Trial Funding Scheme, and also an acknowledgement to the Good Clinical Practice reference material that we've used throughout the development of this training. So we know that the conduct of clinical trials, according to good clinical practice, is a regulatory requirement for drug trials. And we also know currently in the UK, it's a sponsor requirement to conduct all clinical trials to the principles of GCP. And here in the UK, academic statisticians are required to undertake training on GCP, but we've experienced that our training is, and had many discussions about the relevance of the training, because it's usually quite generic and it's been very focused on site level activities. So research staff being based in hospitals or community research sites. And it doesn't therefore tend to cover specifically any statistical activities. But it is important for statisticians, and so what we wanted to do was try and understand the relevance of GCP to statisticians and develop some tailored material. So GCP is the quality standard, as you'll know, that applies throughout all stages of a clinical trial. It's based on the International Council for Harmonisation, Good Clinical Practice. And the ICH GCP. The ICH was developed in 1990 predominantly to bring together regulatory authorities to respond to the increasingly global face of drug development. And it's an internationally recognised agreed guideline for the conduct of clinical trials that involve human subjects. But the guidelines, as you can see on the right-hand side of this screen, are extensive. And there's an expectation that this sets a recognised inspection level for regulators. So here in the UK, we run our trials and the government inspection team are the MHRA, and the MHRA will develop their clinical trials unit inspections around these ICH GCP guidance. I think it's just important to note here that we're talking about processes, clinical trial processes. As statisticians, we're obviously involved in a lot of methodological aspects. The ICH guidance is around the process of delivering trials. It's not around the methodological aspects of the design of a study, and that is generally conducted by our funders through that peer review process that we go through. So this is the definition. Good clinical practice is a set of internationally recognised ethical and scientific quality requirements which must be observed for designing, conducting, recording and reporting clinical trials that involve participation of human subjects. And the role of statisticians and statistics in clinical trial design, conduct, recording and reporting is acknowledged as essential in that ICH guideline. So compliance with good clinical practice provides assurance that the rights, safety and well-being of trial subjects are protected. And we often state in our protocols that we run our trials to comply with the principles of GCP for these very important reasons. And GCP is relevant to all disciplines involved in research. So it does seem sensible that statisticians are trained in how we put these principles of GCP into practice. The ICP GCP guideline contains 13 principles. It was developed by a group of people across the EU, the United States, and worldwide, including the World Health Organization. It was developed in 1996. There have been a few updates since then, and it's a requirement when clinical trial data are intended to be submitted to regulatory authorities. But it is, although it's been developed on the background of drug trials predominantly, it's been recognised by clinical trial sponsors, certainly in the UK, and certainly by clinical trials units in the UK. We have a registered network of 52, currently 52 registered CTUs, and it's recognised by those CTUs that these principles established in this guidance may be applied to other research. So maybe it's lower risk trials, but also some of the observational studies that we might get involved with in the UK in trials units. It's a good practice. It's a good starting point. These are the key principles. You won't be able to read them. We actually have extended the 13 principles from ICH with an additional 3 principles that have come specifically from our MHRA. I'll be circulating the slides afterwards, and these are well published on the ICH website. So how do we enforce these guidelines? Well, according to UK law in 2004, a drug trial was required to be run in accordance with GCP, and all staff were required to be trained in GCP. But as I said, the principles apply to non-drug trials, and from a statistical point of view, as we've said, we didn't feel that the GCP training was particularly specific to us. The UK law is extensive. I'm sure your law and regulatory authorities is just as extensive and complex as ours. And so we wanted some translation, and the way to translate this into practice is through training. So the legal responsibility lies with our sponsors, but as we know, sponsors will delegate those clinical trial duties to CTUs, and the statistical activities fall under these delegated duties. So it is important as statisticians that we fully understand how to implement these principles. And the training is relevant across the, well, ICH GCP is relevant across the life cycle of a trial, and hence GCP training has to be relevant across the life cycle of a trial. And as this cartoon depicts, statisticians, as we know, are involved and will provide input through all stages of a clinical trial, right from the pre-funding activity through to trial design, through to development and conduct, through to archiving and post-funding activities. So documentation, according to GCP, is key to be able to demonstrate that the GCP processes have been followed throughout all of these activities. And it seems sensible we do this through dedicated training. Each individual involved in conducting a clinical trial should be qualified by education, training and experience. So see ICH in their guideline E6. Guideline E9 specifically talks about the trial statistician having a combination of education and training sufficient to implement the principles in GCP and ICH GCP. And there's a quote there from our UK MHRA regulatory body as well. So it's specifically, education and training is specifically recognised by our sponsors and our regulatory agencies and also our funding bodies. And it's recognised by the World Health Organization as well, who quote here, medical research involving human subjects must be conducted only by individuals with appropriate ethics and scientific training and qualification. So this is the kind of background, and I just want to talk through a little bit about how we started this project. So we have, as a UK CRC clinical trials network, this is our network of registered trials units across the UK. We have 6 monthly meetings where our senior statisticians across the trials units come together to share good practice, have conversations about the directions of travel of statistical aspects of of clinical trials. Less so much methodological training, more about how we implement some of the changes in direction that statisticians face, and support each other in doing that. So at a coffee morning, at a coffee break rather, at one of our 6 monthly meetings, we were having a chat about how a few of us had just been on our GCP training, and what we felt about that. And we came back after the coffee break and just asked, there were 45 registered trials units at the time. We just asked each of the representatives to have a sort of hands up exercise to let us know how they had found their GCP training. And the feedback was that most found it interesting and it was very research related. The GCP training that was received was felt to be particularly unrelated to the statistical role, and ultimately by the end of the conversation there was only one person remaining with their hand up, so only one person at the meeting felt there was a need for more role specific training. So we followed the initial scoping review up with a survey. This survey was a formal survey conducted across the network of the 45 trials units at the time. And crucially, you can see from the graphs here that only 11% of the respondents considered their GCP training to be highly relevant to their role. Only 16% thought it had helped them understand GCP requirements related to their role. And the development of a dedicated GCP training course for statisticians was supported by almost 70% of all those respondents. So the UK CRC CTU Statistics Operational Group raised GCP at that point, GCP training for statisticians as a high priority. And the aim of this GSP project, Good Statistical Practice, was to develop dedicated GCP training materials tailored to statisticians to equip them with the knowledge that they need to better understand and implement the GCP requirements in relation to their roles and responsibilities. There is an acknowledgement by our Health Research Authority in the UK and also our regulatory body, the MHRA. They acknowledge that GCP training does not need to follow a generic syllabus and can be tailored to individual roles and responsibilities. And at that time, our UK pharmacists had also come together to develop their own pharmacy-specific GCP training. And so it's great to have an initial conversation with them about how they had progress that, and there was a great deal of learning there. So this is what the proposed plan looks like. We submitted this to our National Institute for Health Research for a very small pot of money to cover some of the workshop activities, which were about pulling people together to share their learning and also share their requirements as we were beginning to think about what the content of a good statistical practice training would look like. So we received a small amount of money to develop this. The plan, as you can see, was to develop initial training and then really crucially to pilot it with our trials units and also to pilot it with statisticians who may not be based in trials units to make sure that the training was also relevant to statisticians working in the wider medical research sphere. So the material has been predominantly developed on our MHRA. We call it the MHRA Grey Guide. It's this little picture in the corner here. This is written by our MHRA regulatory body, and this was written as a this Grey Guide book was written as a collaboration of EMA inspectors, working groups and trials units, and the Health Research Authority at that time. And it does detail the legal requirements specific to the UK and processes specific to the conduct of drug trials in the UK. But I do feel that the recommendations and the guidance that we've developed, is applicable worldwide. And I didn't think it was going to move on there, it did. And the other aspect of the training is not just to base it on the regulatory point of view, but to pull in a lot of the activity that was going on within our UK CRC network. At the time, we had a couple of projects that were going on around the guidance of statistical analysis plans in the early phase and the late phase trials. We also had a bit of work that was going on around the validation of statistical programming. And then there are also the external groups that we follow, such as the Damocles group and the Spirit group for protocols. And we wanted the training to pull together all of this kind of reference material. So we've done that, and we've brought these other guidance documents into the training. And the piloting was essential to make sure that the training was applicable. And so following the initial development and the draft version of the material, we piloted this as small group face-to-face training in 5 of our UK registered CTUs. And this was intended to encourage discussion around the practical implementation of the guidance against those trials unit specific standard operating procedures. Given that we all have slightly different operating procedures, in our individual CTUs, how to make sure that the training worked across a 45 trials unit network at the time was really important to us. And the activities are very focused on the practical implementation. And so there was a lot of work trying to pull experience from the 45 trials units on real life scenarios that they'd experienced from either MHRA inspections or things that had cropped up within the life cycle of their trial, or things that had cropped up in their previous GCP training. And the training was summarised also outside of the CTU network at an invited parallel session of the NIHR Statistics Group. So this is our National Institute for Health and Care Research that fund a lot of our trials. They have their own dedicated statistics group and an annual meeting. So we were invited to summarise what we've been doing in a parallel kind of workshop there. And this allowed us to get some feedback around the accessibility of this training outside of the CTU network. And we also delivered the pilot training in a full day workshop to members of 14 NIHR statisticians who weren't specifically working in clinical trials, and we received some structured and anonymous feedback from them as well. This is the feedback that we had from the CTU. It was received overwhelmingly positive. Sorry, I can't speak at 7 o'clock in the morning. The face-to-face engagement was really particularly highlighted, and also the relevance to new starters. And this made us start thinking around the relevance of delivering this training as part of an induction package for new starters, but also then how frequently we need to come back to this training for those who've already undergone that induction process. So that was helpful. And this is some of the feedback that we received from the NIHR. Again, over 90% of the attendees to the workshop agreed or strongly agreed that the training was relevant to their role. It would increase their understanding of GCP requirements, and they'd be able to apply these new learning skills. So it was great to hear after we put all of the work in that we've done something. We felt there was a gap, and we felt we were developing something that filled that gap. The piloting did highlight to us the desire for the training to be a standalone training. I think we'd originally thought we would develop it as an adjunct to the GCP training that we were all receiving with our sort of site level staff. So we also at that time then developed an additional generic module on the core GCP principles to allow those units who wanted this to be a standalone GCP training course that they could do that. I think in practice most people still go to the generic GCP. I think you always learn something from that. So we've made it accessible, and we've developed it in line with the feedback from what people wanted. There was also feedback around the delivery of the training to be flexible as face-to-face, so to be able to have a discussion in a face-to-face small group kind of training session about how the guidance impacted on local SOPs, but also recognising that not all statisticians work in a team, and we do have NIHR statisticians working quite independently. So to allow the training to be fully accessible and address different environments where medical statisticians were based, we developed a sort of e-learning tool. So this is currently sitting on our NIHR Learn. We've got an NIHR Learn website where you can access sort of online training, and actually the NIHR have taken the kind of guidance that we've developed and are making it far more interactive as it sits on that NIHR Learn website. So that's going to be great, and it was certainly out of my expertise to be able to develop into that very interactive tool. This is just what it looks like at the minute on the NIHR website. And it's currently, as I said, undergoing formatting to give that better online experience. And then the next stage was making sure that it was acceptable really with our regulators. And the MHRA, who's our regulatory body in the UK, cannot endorse any training. So it was difficult to work out how we could get this reviewed and sort of get it signed off, which we're not able to be fair. But but they were really pleased to be involved and have been really pleased to be a named collaborator. And we've had full engagement with the MHRA throughout the project. The MHRA, one of the inspectors, came to our UK CRC stats group and talked about, inspection and talked about training with us. They've had sight of the material that we've developed, and they've fed back on the final content. So although they're not allowed to endorse anything, actually they've had full input into this, and that's been fantastic. And we've learned a lot through that process. The NIHR as our funder obviously have had a lot of involvement and review, and they've endorsed and facilitated the upload onto their NIHR Learn platform for wider accessibility. And we're keen that the GCP training materials are easily accessible and freely available to anybody who wants them. And there's a variety of portals that people can access the materials through. And it's really important that we do disseminate that we've done this work and that the materials exist. So we have published earlier this year a paper in the Trials Journal for full dissemination out with of the NIHR kind of publications that we're required to do as part of our funding. So what does the actual training look like? So we've developed a comprehensive set of training slides to provide a high-level overview of GCP requirements and recommendations for best statistical practice. The training consists of these 5 modules that you can see stated here. This modular approach allows you to dip in and dip out of the modules at times that are good for you, rather than running the 5 modules in one sitting. And the modules follow a logical order of the progressive stages of a clinical trial, from the core regulations in module 1, but through the design of a study, as you can see in module 3, right through to statistical analysis and reporting in module 5, which, to be fair, is where we thought we were starting. Module 5 is where we started. That was the real gap in the training. But through the learning of going through the MHRA Grey Guide, actually, and the fact that statisticians are involved in the life cycle of a trial, it didn't make sense to not have training in relation to trial design and trial conduct. So although module 5 contains the content that's most relevant to sort of statistical program and statistical analysis, then we have developed a wider, more comprehensive package of training. So we've tabulated, this is a table that's come out of our NIHR report. We've tabulated in that report the areas of the training that are directly related to statistical activities, which really fall into that module 5, covering analysis plans, analysis populations, interim analysis, stats programming. But we've also tabulated the areas of statistical activities that would usually require some statistical content, so such as Module 3 in trial design and Module 4 in data management. So that would be covering things like CRF design, database design, data monitoring, data locks, database locks, etc. And we've also documented and tabulated the additional topics that are applicable to statistical staff, where we should have some awareness, such as Module 2, record keeping and documentation, and Module 1, quality systems and trial management folders, etc. And this then just does allow the training to be a standalone training, which is part of the feedback that we'd required, that we'd had. So there's obviously not enough time to go through the course today. For your information, it probably takes about 3 hours. We've run this a couple of times in our unit, and we block out a half-day activity with all our statisticians, because we try and encourage, the slides are generic across units. We try and encourage discussion around how these principles reflect our current operating systems and where there may be gaps, or where maybe our operating systems, our standard operating procedures, maybe don't reflect the breadth of our unit, and we might need to make some tweaks. So we do allocate a half-day event to this when we're running this as a small group face-to-face activity. So what I've done, just to finish off in the last sort of 10 minutes or so, is I've just extracted some real-life MHRA findings and pulled out a couple of the training slides to demonstrate our approach and the terminology that we've used in addressing the training in relation to those. So Module 5 is our statistical analysis and reporting module. These are, so our MHRA is our regulatory body, and you can access all of the documents around inspections on our MHRA government website. So these are just a couple of quotes that I've taken, that I've found through this website in relation to inspections that have been conducted across the UK. So the first one here is around data extraction used for analysis and the use of hard coding, where there was no documentation of when temporary hard coding had been removed from a statistical programme. And the second example that I've pulled out here, maybe should have broken them into 2 slides, but anyway, is around the multiple runs of statistical analysis programs and the record keeping to demonstrate why these multiple runs had taken place. And slightly concerning quote here, that the inspectees were unable to explain why a primary endpoint analysis had been repeated several times, and despite being repeated on the same data extract, how the p-value had changed, which is a little bit concerning. I was quite concerned when I read that. So these are the kind of slides that we have in our training around hard coding. So this guidance is directly taken out of our grey guide. So specifying that hard coding is exactly what hard coding is, and essentially that it's not acceptable, and processes should be in place to try and prevent that. That the need of hard coding should be justified, and some guidance around, if you are going to use it in a temporary fashion, that after databases are amended, then the code needs to be changed, and having documentation and a written procedure to be able to document exactly why that has happened, and the dates of when that happened and the dates of when that hard coding have been removed, and obviously that to evidence that they've been removed before a final analysis. And then in relation to the second example, the second finding, MHRA finding in relation to multiple runs of analysis, multiple runs of programming, I think this is all kind of tied up in our stats analysis plan, and the timing of analyses should be documented in our analysis plans, and how frequently you're going to be running those analyses, and what you're actually going to be running. So here's an example slide highlighting the importance of an analysis plan, but also the importance of the timing of an analysis plan. Its alignment with the protocol, and the aim of it to facilitate transparency of who is in an analysis, who is out of an analysis, what the definition of some of our outcomes are. Some of our outcomes are programmed and are made up from lots of multiple data fields in our databases. So making sure that that's being developed in an unbiased and robust and transparent way. And the main features of analysis plan is that it should be pre-specified, it should be aligned with the protocol, and it should be a more technical and detailed elaboration of a plan that already exists in our protocol for the trial. That the SAP should be version controlled and it should be finalised and reviewed by appropriate personnel. And this is another slide that we use in the training, and this is just highlighting some of the published guidance that exists around analysis plans, and also reflection and guidance and signposting to the ICH, specific guidance on statistical principles in E9 that you'll be aware of. And I think in relation to that second example, there is an assessment of the quality control. And, if you've taken a data download and you're able to run programs multiple times on the same data set, then it begs the question how you do get different p-values. So I think this is where quality control is really important, and we do have some slides in the guidance around the necessity of applying QC checks to statistical analysis, and the need for a clear process of QC for statistical analysis. This is a slide just documenting some other inspection questions that some may be on the MHRA website, but also these have come through the development of the training came off the back of experiences, some of the experiences that the trials units had going through an inspection, and some of the questions that actually they'd received. So we've collated these MHRA questions as part of the sort of engagement in the team to say, if this, as part of your training, if you consider each of these questions, what would your response be if you were presented with this by an MHRA inspector or a regulatory inspection? And how would you answer these questions, and how can you benchmark some of these in line with your own standard operating procedures? This is Module 4. Module 4 is to discuss the principles of GCP in relation to data management. And these are some of the MHRA inspection findings that we found here. So lack of documentation and decision-making around processes regarding database locks. There were several database locks in a particular trial, and 3 were following release of unblinded data. Insufficient documentation to demonstrate when database pages have been frozen and refrozen in between database locks. So this falls into our kind of data management training in Module 4. Here's an example slide from Module 4 detailing the provision of trial data and how it should follow a formal data lock process. I'd be asking people in our training, if we see this slide, do we think that we have a final formal database lock process, and can we evidence that to an inspector? There's a recommendation for a checklist to confirm that the completion of key activities have been undertaken before locking the database and released. And do we have one, and could we evidence that with an inspector if they came and questioned us about this? And this is some of the guidance around the procedure being appropriately robust, and it must be apparent that the data are final and that files should be suitably protected. And again, here's some other MHRA inspection questions in relation to database lock and data management. As part of the training, you can consider each of these questions either on your own or as part of the team, and what your response might be in relation to your own standard operating procedures. And then an example from Module 3, which is discussing the principles of GCP in relation to trial design and specifically randomization and blinding. We have some example MHRA questions here, predominantly from our networking activity rather than the MHRA webpage. These have come from our networking activities. So these are questions relating to trial design, protocol development, randomization, blinding. And as part of the training, again, you can consider as a team or on your own what your response might be if you were inspected or questioned about these, and whether this is currently, you know, appropriately addressed in your own operating procedures. Again, the operating procedures are about guidance of conduct. They're not around the methodology, you know, around how you do the randomization. It's more about how you do the randomization in a practical sense rather than the kind of randomization spec and the methodology of the randomization. So here's an example slide, training slide from module 3, recommending that the statistician should be providing input into the writing and development of the protocol, and the protocol must be followed, and our stats analysis plan should be aligned with those protocols, and that the role of the statistician in designing the trial and writing the sections of the protocol may be examined during a GCP inspection. So the documentation must be retained to be able to demonstrate that there has been that input. Here's an example slide from module 3 about how randomization methods must be able to be reconstructed at the end of the trial, and the expectation to be able to evidence the statistical input into that randomization process. And here's an example slide also from module 3 regarding the procedures to control access to the randomization schedule and treatment allocations, such as through data monitoring committee reports, and how they should strictly be enforced specifically for blinded trials. And again, asking, you know, anyone to either on their own or as part of a team, how you may evidence this for your trials. So I'm just going to come back and kind of tie up with a summary that we've developed, this very kind of comprehensive top level, high level overview of GCP requirements and recommendations. The training consists of these 5 modules and it follows the full life cycle of the trial. So it is comprehensive in that sense. The materials are accessible, they're comprehensive. It's a package that we have introduced into our CTU network to provide an introduction for good clinical practice for statisticians who are involved in the conduct and analysis of clinical research. So although this has started and has been developed by predominantly statisticians working in clinical trials units, we have also piloted and had feedback and ensured that the training is also relevant to statisticians who are working in clinical research generally. It is dedicated and tailored training to statisticians, and the aim of it has been to strengthen the knowledge of the regulatory requirements, to strengthen the interpretation of GCP and the implementation of it into practice. The whole training encourages good practice at a high level. We do this training every 2 years in our unit. That's the recommendation, that all staff will come together and go through this training every 2 years. And you always come back to something that you've forgotten about. So we always learn something when we come back to our GCP training. And the idea is that we will lead on transparent and reproducible statistical activity that is required for inspection. So these are just some of the acknowledgements. These are the kind of the type project writing group, essentially driving group. This was developed and funded and delivered through the UKCRC Stats Operations Group as a whole, which represents currently 52 registered trials units across the UK. It's been piloted in clinical trials units and NIHR staff working in universities, and the acknowledgements of these sites are listed here. It's been piloted through a workshop with the NIHR Statistics Group, and as I say, we've had some input and feedback from the MHRA, and also really grateful to NIHR Learn for developing a far more accessible online experience with the slides. So I think I'll probably stop sharing my screen if I can do that, and I will hand back to Sabine, I think.
Yes, I think Sabine might be having some network issues, so you can hand back to me. I'm here, I'm Vivian at ACTA. We do have a couple of questions from the audience for you. Thank you so much for that insightful presentation, Deb. I'll just go through them just one by one, I suppose. What are the latest trends in good clinical practice that statisticians should be aware of?
The latest trends. I think that a lot of the questions that we get are around the trends is a difficult one. I think I'm going to bring it back to the questions that we get most frequently asked about, because I guess that's the feedback as we're starting, you know, the paper came out earlier this year. And so we're starting to get feedback around how this is being implemented, you know, across our statistical networks. And the most frequent questions that we get are around the analysis plans and the kind of the level of detail that needs to be in then, and whether that all needs to be in right at the beginning. There's lots of guidance that's coming out around adaptive trials from ICH and how we deliver adaptive trials. And the difficulty is if you write your analysis plan from version 1 for that adaptive trial, or any trial actually, you know, a lot of complex trials and a lot of complex analysis tied into, you know, simple 2-arm trials as well. But do we need to be writing that level of detail in version 1 of that analysis plan right at the beginning, when a lot of our studies that are funded by NIHR have a kind of run-in pilot phase? And if those trials don't get through that pilot phase, that work and that analysis plan falls down, because you often are closed because you haven't got the required number of patients, or you're not going to achieve that required number of patients. So the kind of analysis plan falls down if you have only recruited, you know, 50 out of 5,000 patients to your trial. So we do get a lot of the trends are around the questions coming through are generally around the level of detail and the version control of an analysis plan, and what needs to be in and when, and how we individually as trials units document our analysis plans, either in a single version or whether we have multiple versions of analysis plans. And there's no rights and wrongs. I think it's what fits in with your SOPs and it fits in with your unit. And we've made some decisions around that. They may not be applicable for all, you know, for all. But I think as long as you can justify your approach at an inspection. So I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And then there's a follow-up that sort of links in with that. What are some of the common mistakes that statisticians make in clinical trials, and how can they be avoided?
I think the biggest thing in relation to this training is around documentation. You know, we're all, you know, academic statisticians, and academia is busy. And so we might know some of these principles, and we might tie some of these principles into our SOPs, and there'll be an awareness of them. I think it's very different than having an inspection and somebody coming and asking you to, you know, evidence all of that decision making that we might have made, and how do you evidence that, and where do you put that evidence? So I think it's really important as we make key decisions that we document that somewhere. The question is, where do you document it, and how do you come back to that to evidence that decision that you might have made? So we really encourage our statisticians to use the analysis plan document that we have as a document that they write for them, that reflects some of the discussions and decision making that we've had to make through that trial. If there's a very big decision making regarding the design of the study, that would then be evidenced in a change to the protocol, and there'll be a minute of meeting of, you know, a data monitoring committee or something about why that protocol change was required. I think it becomes more difficult when there's feedback at data monitoring committees around analysis plans. You know, how do we just keep that documentation? So we do use our analysis plans as version control documents, and encourage our statisticians to make notes in them in those interim versions that are not signed off. So we'll have official signed versions, and then we'll have version controlled documents that are authored by the statisticians as their documents, and they're allowed to go in and make these notes to make sure that we're documenting everything. Because I think in a busy unit, when you're working on multiple trials, that's the hardest thing, and I think that's where we often fall down.
I might throw back to Sabina in a moment, although I have had a couple of questions, so I might bring that one forward about the actual material. Is there a link or an email address where they could get access to the GSP materials? Then someone saying that would be so useful to getting started with considering and developing some training here for Australia, and that the ACTA Statistics Group might be a really good place to develop such materials.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, in the UK, you know, it's sitting on our funder. I've got this NIHR Learn platform, so anyone who's involved in NIHR research can access it. We have a trials unit network of 52, you know, trials units, so it's sitting on that network. So it's difficult, but we want we feel that the training is applicable outside of the UK, and hence, you know, why we're talking today. But I'm getting lots of email requests around, you know, access to the slide set. So there is a PDF set of the slides that we've separated into the 5 modules that I'm really happy to share. And we're also trying to, so we've just had the International Clinical Trials Methodology Conference, and we submitted an application to host a 3-hour workshop there, and it was really well attended. So, you know, there's opportunities for the information to be used as a workshop, and to be developing, you know, workshops on the back of the materials. And so we've done a little bit of that. So if there is demand for that, we can continue to do that. But also we're really happy to share the slide set. So I can do that with you after the call, and Sabine will be getting all the information from the International Clinical Trials Conference anyway. But I would just, you know, I would just say to you to use it as you feel would be helpful, you know, within your networks. All that we ask is, you know, that you acknowledge us. So if you know, share anything, or that you just acknowledge the UK CRC network and NIHR as funders, but that's incorporated into the slide set anyway.
Thank you so much. Sabine, can I throw back over to you?
Yes, thank you. I'm very sorry, Deborah, but I have a very bad connection. So if I drop out, Vivian will take over again. But thank you so much for your presentation. I found it an excellent resource that are very valuable to look forward to. And yes, I think having access to that resource will be so valuable for us in our day-to-day work as statisticians. And I think that the slide sets, thank you so much for offering them to share. They will be very useful for many of us. I obviously attended your workshop back in the UK, and one of the comments that you made at the end was very interesting in terms of the usefulness of actually documenting the database lock and the unblinding and the statistical analysis plan dates, not only for audits of the actual inspections by MHRA, but maybe also for publication purposes. And I was wondering whether you could share that experience with the Australian audience. Yeah.
Yeah, that was that's the first time that I've ever experienced this. And I think I've worked in clinical trials for, you know, nearly 30 years, and you see over that time span the role of, you know, our funding peer review, but also the role of our peer review at publication. And so, you know, we're used to going through that peer review process and responding to comments at the point of publication. And we're starting to, you know, see journals now asking for our analysis plans, and that's great. We're starting to on the back of that, we're starting to publish our analysis plans, and the timing of that can be difficult as well in the life cycle of a trial. But so I think it's great that funders, that journals are now starting to either publish our analysis plans or ask, you know, for them at the point of publication of a trial. But the experience that I had, which has then gone to the next step earlier this year, was the journal requested the analysis plan. That was fine. Wanted confirmation in the sort of text comments back that the analysis plan had been, you know, signed off prior to database lock, and we responded to say that process had happened. And then they came back and asked us to evidence that. And we were a little bit unsure about how to evidence this, except for, you know, taking screenshots of the date stamp of the documents and the date stamps of the, so we went back and said, you know, have we misunderstood what you're asking for? We think that this is, you know, potentially only doable via date stamps. Is that what you're wanting? And they said yes. So we essentially had our analysis plan PDF signed version with a date stamp in a, you know, in a screenshot. We took a screenshot of that, and then we had our SAS data set, which we downloaded. We use a macro database in Leeds. So we had a SAS data set which evidenced the date that we'd downloaded the data out of macro into that data set, and had our first raw SAS data set. And we obviously had a SAS data set with a date stamp, and we had to take a screenshot of that and send both of those screenshots back to say we can evidence that the date of our analysis plan is less and, you know, before the screenshot of our SAS data set. That's the first time I've ever been asked to do that. And I don't know whether I'll ever be asked to do that again, but it did feel as if, you know, that was another step, another shift in the direction of transparency. So anyway, it did get published, which is good. So we did get that trial published, but it was a bizarre experience, and I don't know whether that will be a direction of travel, but essentially, you know, you can be asked anything.
Yeah, so for anyone who isn't yet convinced about good statistical practice for the purpose of doing good clinical practice for statisticians.
I sort of missed the end of that. Oh, I think Sabine's gone. Did you hear that? Sorry,
No,
Vivian.
no. Yeah, no, I heard her drop off as well. She must have, yeah, real connection problems. Another question, we've still got a couple of minutes. What other resources or tools would you recommend for further learning?
So there are lots of references that we've included in the slide set for each of the modules. So there's obviously a lot of, sorry, is that me? Sorry.
I think that's the lag of Sabina hopping through. I'm going to try and kick her out and see if she can join back in.
Okay, I'll keep going. Each of the modules has a final slide, which is, you know, a signposting of reference material. Some of that is signposting to, you know, regulatory websites. Some of it is pointing to some of the other guidance that we've developed in the UK CRC network. Some of it is pointing to, you know, published guidance around, you know, the Damocles group and data monitoring committees and Spirit guidance and Consort and all of those. So each of the modules has a final slide with a key list of references at the end that are relevant to that module. So yes, there's lots of signposting and lots of bedtime reading.
Fascinating stuff, I'm absolutely sure. Okay, let me see if there's any other questions that I can go through.
I think
in general, how have CTUs in the UK integrated GCP for statisticians into their standard operating procedures or working instructions?
Okay, so I think it's less about sort of integrating, it's more about running the training and thinking alongside whether your operating procedures are relevant in relation to the training that you're doing. So when we started doing this, we were obviously involved in the pilot phase of this, and I was using my statistics team, and we have a real breadth of trials. So bearing in mind that the GCP is relevant to drug trials, I work in surgical trials. We also have some very low risk studies which are, you know, comparing multiple standards of care. We've got variability of practice, you know, in the UK across various interventions. So we have trials where we're randomizing people between different standards of care rather than, you know, a new intervention. And the risk level of those trials is far less. So, you know, if you think about a drug trial being, you know, if you think of that as being a high risk trial, then do you really need the same level of documentation and, you know, et cetera, if you've got a very low risk trial comparing different standards of care, and making sure that you don't bring some of the training into your SOPs and make your SOPs so strict that you then are applying, you know, a very detailed operating procedure then against a very low risk trial, because those low risk trials often have less funding, have, you know, less statistical time funded in them. So I think it's making sure that in your unit, for your studies that you're doing, running through the training and benchmarking against the types of trials that you're running. Do we need to be this transparent? Would this be a finding if we were inspected on it? And really encouraging a risk adapted approach in this. We're giving guidance around, you know, drug trials, because that's where our reference material starts point from, and that's where we're predominantly inspected. But I think, you know, thinking about it in a risk adapted approach and for implementation of lower risk trials is really important, and making sure hence that your standard operating procedures reflect the portfolio of trials that you're working on, and you don't tie yourself up in too many knots.
All right. Thank you so much. I think this webinar has been really, really helpful and shows the importance of the training in this area. What we'll do is collate that material, if possible, or any other links that you're willing to share, and send them across to the group. This webinar is also recorded, so statisticians and health economists are welcome to circulate that. And I can just see Sabina's joining again. I'll just see if she wants to make any other final comments. Sabine, we've just finished off all of our questions from the group. If you'd like to make any closing comments, we will. Otherwise, we'll thank Deborah for her time this morning and send her off to get a cup of coffee.
Yeah, breakfast time for me now.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much, Deborah. I'm sorry I dropped out again. It was an issue while I was presenting with WebEx. But thank you so much for spending your morning with us. And I think we all found it, well, I found it very valuable, and I hope the others did as well. Thank you, everyone, for joining in the late afternoon on Monday. And there is a post-web survey, I believe, Vivian, that people can join. So we love to hear your feedback. So thank you, everyone, again, and hope to see you again at the next Statistician webinar.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very, very much. And if there's any feedback, you know, that you want to share with us, that would be really helpful. It's quite new. It's rolling out, but it's quite new. So we're always looking for feedback as well about what we've developed. So, but thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me.